I am a TV reporter through and through, so I've got some pictures that I brought along that I wanted to show you. Pictures worth 1,000 words. But I do want to raise my hands to the Nanaimo Nation and thank you for sharing and hosting this really important, critical conversation here in Nanaimo traditional territory. An elder once came up to me and I introduced myself. I said, "My name is Duncan McCue. I'm a reporter with CBC News." And he said, "A reporter, eh?" He said, let me tell you something," he said, "about you reporters." He said, you're never going to get into the news if you're an Indian unless you're one of the 4 Ds. And I said, "The 4 Ds, what are the 4 Ds? And he said, "Well, you're never going to get into the news if you're an Indian, if you're not drumming, and if you're not dancing, if you're not dead, and if you're not drunk." And I looked at him and I said, "Okay, that's being a little bit simple." But you know, with elders, you think about their words and you ponder over them. And over time, I started to look at the news media a little bit closer. And it's interesting, those 4 Ds do start to show up an awful lot in the news media. This is from CBC.ca. This is a story about third world living conditions, and this was the photo that was adjoined it. This one's interesting. Look at the headline, and then look at the photo that accompanied it. I'm not sure what they were trying to point out. Maybe CSIS is infiltrating the Powwow Highway. I'm not sure. This is a story about a pipeline protest. There were thousands of people there, and this was the photo that ended up on the front page. Or if you're an Aboriginal person, you know, take your drum, and you'll certainly end up in the newspaper. This was Aboriginal Day of Action. Story about residential schools. Story about missing and murdered Native women. Story about Native education. Story about the Picton trial. Here's an interesting experiment. Google dead and Aboriginal, and then look up Google News. Look at the past couple of weeks of coverage. Here's just a sampling of what happened in the past couple of weeks in the newspapers. 4,000 Aboriginal people dead at residential school. Brian Sinclair, inquiry is going on in Manitoba, a man who was in hospital for over 40 hours and then released and died. A murder trial of a Native woman in Regina. More children dying while in care, foster care in Alberta. And of course, the many, many accidents, tragic accidents that happen in First Nation communities across this country. No question, there's a disproportionate amount of death amongst Aboriginal people in Canada, and it makes the news. Fortunately, the drunk stereotype is on the wane in the news, but there are an awful lot of substance abuse issues and stories that end up in our newspapers. And this was one of the most tragic one of them all. It still pains me to see that photo. Now, the 4 Ds, I relate it. It's not meant to be a sophisticated analysis of media representation of Aboriginal peoples, and I don't present it that way. But there is a grain of truth to the 4 Ds, as I hope I've just pointed out with some of these pictures. And here's my point, that throughout history, throughout Canadian history, media, the press, have presented the same tropes and stereotypes that we have seen of Aboriginal people that we see in Canadian literature and that we see in Canadian history. And some of those, the 4 Ds are some of those examples. But for a more sophisticated analysis, perhaps you might want to take a look at Daniel Francis's book, Imaginary Indian, where he argues the Indian began as a white man's mistake and became a white man's fantasy. His point being that popular media have portrayed Indians, and that has little to do with indigenous realities. Or for an even more sophisticated analysis, perhaps take a look at this book, Seeing Red, where the authors studied over 100 years of newspaper coverage in Canada of Aboriginal people. And to boil down their point, they say that the press have essentially propped up colonialism, in their words, and that they have reinforced policies of land dispossession and assimilation, which are accepted norms in Canada. Has the mainstream press expressed ideas and representations that support the thinking that gave rise to treaties in residential schools? The short answer is yes. And so I raise these points just to say, why are we here? We're here because of this. And if you're trying to understand what that was about, then it's important to understand how the media have represented Aboriginal people over the past 100 years. And why did over 100 people show up at the Nanaimo Daily News, a small town newspaper, over a letter to the editor? And why did they call it racism? We in the media in the 21st century have to move beyond the same tired narratives that we've been telling Canadians for the past 150 years about Aboriginal people. We need to move beyond victims, and we need to move beyond warriors. That's the media's responsibility. And there's a reason for that. There's the right thing, it's the right thing to do. That's blatantly obvious. But there's another reason. There's a business case. Our audiences, the mainstream media, and I'm talking to the media out here now, our audiences are shrinking. And if our audiences don't like what they see about the way that we covered Aboriginal people, they're just going to find their news elsewhere. Or they're going to turn to their Twitter feeds. We need to bring everybody, all of our communities, all of our country, into the tent, in the press. And that means the kinds of stories we cover and the types of stories we choose to cover, most importantly. And that's all kind of glum. It's all kind of doom and gloom. But there is good news. I'm going to tell you some of the good news.
I can't see it. No.
He's going to fix it all. But there's no question that there are more and more Aboriginal Indigenous reporters in newsrooms right across this country, and that's making a difference. More Aboriginal reporters means a more balanced portrait of Aboriginal people in this country. It means more story ideas, it means more nuanced stories, I think. And there's no question that there's nothing but good news coming from Aboriginal People's Television Network. We are seeing the growth of independent Indigenous media in this country, and that is going to change this business in only good ways. And I love their cut line for the way that they promote their news that not only informs, but inspires. And I think that's important for all mainstream media outlets to remember. Indigenous people, we can't just play in our own sandbox, okay? We need to be part of the mainstream media as well. We need to be part of the national conversation that is going on with regard to Aboriginal peoples and our place in this country. And so that's why it's important that we train all journalists so that they have a basic cultural competency when it comes to dealing with Indigenous communities. And I'm proud to say I'm part of that at the University of British Columbia and the School of Journalism and our Reporting in Indigenous Communities class. And then there are programs like the Journalists for Human Rights, who are training citizen Aboriginal journalists, Aboriginal citizen journalists. They're going up to Northern Ontario and they're training folks in the communities to report from their communities. And that kind of work is important to do. And then I'm also really pleased to see things like this, CBC Aboriginal, which we've just recently launched as a digital platform. To me, that signifies that the mainstream media is finally starting to get it, that Aboriginal issues are important public policy issues in this country and that they deserve specialized coverage, just like business, just like health, just like sports. And so check it out, CBC Aboriginal. It's I think, the way that the conversation is going to start to grow at CBC at least. So those are all really positive things, I think, about mainstream media and coverage. And because this is the Stone Ages, right? And publishing a letter that was frankly full of untruths and ignorance is not freedom of speech. And I think it actually showed a contempt for journalists' duties toward accuracy and to avoid discrimination. And so we're all here today, I'm happy to say, we're all here today because I think things are changing, as we've heard from our leadership here today. Things are changing. And I think as we start to have more of these conversations, that we're going to start to see more stories like this, more stories about reconciliation, more stories about diversity, more stories that capture the complexity of Indigenous realities in this country instead of the tired old narratives. And I think those stories are going to help all of us in Canada be better neighbors. Jimmy Gwitch.
I'll do it.
Thank you, Duncan. Thank you very much, Miigwech.